Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Angela Wilkinson. I'm the Senior Director of Business Insights and Scenarios at the World Energy Council. I'd like to welcome you to this morning's session on the World Energy Council's Scenarios 2019. Who in the room is not interested in knowing what the future of energy holds? Who is interested to know which energy future we are preparing for? Today, we're going to explore three different futures of energy, which are one of the key tools that the World Energy Council uses to support an informed dialogue on energy systems transition worldwide. Joining me today are a couple of remarkable speakers, and I would like to welcome them up to join me on the stage. Leo Birnbaum is a member of the Managing Board of E.ON and an officer of the World Energy Council. Leo, please join me. Thank you. Muqsit Ashraf is Managing Director and Global Head of Energy and Accenture Strategy. Muqsit. Jed Davis is Executive Chair of the World Energy Council's Scenario Initiative. Jed, please. So, today, we're going to not just present the new scenarios, we're going to discuss how they might be useful and used by people. And Leo, I wonder if you would kick us off. As an energy executive, what do you like about scenarios? And in particular, what is it that interests you about the World Energy Council scenarios?
First, why do I use, sorry for that, where do I use scenarios? And I think there are two ways of using them. The one is it gives you a reference. It gives you a reference whether the strategy which you're pursuing somehow makes sense in the context in which you're moving. And so, for example, we have seen that all scenarios show that we are moving towards a more demand-driven, more customer-centric world. Mm-hmm. And we as E.ON have actually pursued a strategy to spin off our generation and to focus completely on customer solutions and networks. So for us, it is important when we take such a big bet, are we actually swimming against the mainstream? Are we somehow within the zeitgeist? We might still pursue a strategy which is completely against that, but then we should do that very consciously. So it's a frame of reference. The other one is scenarios give us a chance to calibrate observations which we make to understand in which directions are we moving. So we're reading newspapers, I'm reading newspapers, and then I'm thinking, oh, that's a good sign of more global coordination. It's more symphony, so to say. Or this is a sign of more hard rock again. Yeah? And I have to say, sadly, over the last 3 years, we have seen too many unilateralism trends, movements towards hard rock. So it gives you a reference also to calibrate what you're observing. What I like about the World Energy Scenarios is, to be very clear, they're impartial because they're not driven by somebody coming from the oil sector, the coal sector, or whatever. They're truly global, and they're actually plausible scenarios which don't start with a result which you want to get out. They're not normative. And in that sense, I think they are a useful reference, because if you use a Greenpeace scenario, for example, as a reference, you know what you're going to get, because you know what they want to get out of the scenarios before they even get in. And therefore, I think the World Energy Scenarios are actually best possible reference I have found for my work.
Oh, thanks, Leo. Well, to help everybody understand when they read the newspaper, which signal of which scenario they might be seeing, Jed, why don't you please take us through the new set of scenarios that we're launching?
Okay, I'm going to stand up. I find it easier to do that. The starting point, in a way, was almost 5 years ago. We developed for 2016 a set of futures through to 2060, really with a strong focus on the issues of climate change, but also some messages about possibly the peaking of per capita primary energy demand in the coming decade, issues about peak demand for oil and coal, the emergence of new technologies. And this time we focused on something quite different. we focus very much on the routes to 2040. Where are the turning points in the next 2 decades that will lead us from where we are into a new world, which will challenge our investments, our enterprises, our relationships. And really the starting point, and you may have better information than me, are what we would call the unknowables, the critical elements that are likely to happen regardless of scenario, that they appear to be real, and we call that the grand transition. This is a world in which population will be declining compared with the last 40 years, where we're looking at a movement of the center of gravity of the world's economy, influence in geopolitics, more towards the east. We're looking not at just one issue, the issue of climate change. We're looking at a variety of challenges, and we are quite unclear as to where the focus of our attention will be, but we know that's important. Before I give you a video on the scenarios, I'd like to make an important point. When we talk scenarios, it's technical. Let's bring it down to the fundamental basis. We all need a view and have a view of the world, and that is a complex view. The 3 scenarios developed are really more 3 different types of mindsets which shape our view of where the future will go, which we find within this global community of the World Energy Council. And there are some critical uncertainties which will determine which of these mindsets becomes the dominant. The critical uncertainties which shape these scenarios are, one, we're in a new world of innovation, a new industrial revolution. So there's a really big question about how rapid that will be. We face in many parts of the world, particularly the most developed, productivity growth issues, jobs issues, and they are very important in shaping the potential for the future. So that is uncertain. What's uncertain also, as I said, is the environmental focus and the energy and effort and collective effort and the possibility of collective effort for addressing climate change. And that really goes back to the way we govern ourselves. Is sovereignty, national sovereignty in its purest form, going to be the way we move forward? Is the way of tackling issues? Or can we strengthen the existing multilateral system as a collective solver of problems? So with that in mind and those uncertainties, what are the 3 scenarios that we've developed? If we could see the video, please.
Technological developments, along with societal, geopolitical, and environmental shifts, mean the world is changing faster and more fundamentally than ever. We call this journey the grand transition. Our 3 scenarios are platforms for discussions about the future to 2040. Modern jazz is a market-driven world of rapid innovation, but uneven gains and potential for new system shocks. Innovation drives down costs and accelerates end-use electrification. Many consumers become producers, exporting energy back to the grid. By 2040, the speed of innovation outpaces governments' abilities to shape better policies. Inequality increases, and responses to climate change are ad hoc. Are we prepared for this innovative, agile, and consumer-centric world? Unfinished Symphony is a global policy-enabled world. Long-term planning and coordinated action address connected challenges. There is broad agreement about the integrated actions needed to reach net zero emissions, but regions take different paths. Policy integration, infrastructure planning, and investment drive clean energy trade on a global and local basis. Energy transition is well managed, but slow and expensive. The world is not fully on track to meet the Paris Agreement. How can we seize new opportunities for united and integrated action? Hard rock is a fragmented world with increasing barriers to trade, capital and technology transfer. Nations are concerned with energy security and local environmental problems. The world becomes multipolar. Weak economic growth and limited investment in energy transformation increase the impacts of connected environmental risks. In order to cope with environmental shocks, sub-regions begin to collaborate. How can we create opportunities in a fragmented world? These scenarios present significant choices for the energy sector. Underlying all of these is the reality that the energy system is changing, and changing fast. How we face this uncertain future is a question for us all.
So, Jed, 3 different views of the future: modern jazz, unfinished symphony, and hard rock. How do we get our heads around some of the turning points you mentioned around these scenarios at the start?
Well, the turning points, let us take each of the scenarios. Modern jazz is really, you could say, hyper-innovative. In fact, what I would note in the last 3 years in the World Energy Council is a real ramping up of our understanding of innovation. And in fact, that tends to run all the way through the document itself and the work that we've done. So I think that's important. The turning point really is when we see new technologies beginning to move significantly to the point they are cost competitive with existing ones. So for example, with the right incentives in unfinished symphony, we could look at and also within modern jazz, sometime in the 20s, mid to late 20s, we might be looking at battery electric vehicles being essentially on parity with the internal combustion engine. And once that happens, of course, a lot is possible. At the moment, we see opportunities in many areas. I would say there are a number of takeaways from this. I think, let me just say a few words on hard rock before I do that, because hard rock is seen as a negative, inward-looking story. I think we've tried to better understand it in the last 3 years. It may be that the only way we solve some of the stresses and strains of this emerging industrial revolution and challenge to jobs is by bringing decision-making down to the national level, where you can, in some ways, control better the problems that are in hand. It's not a question of being desirable or not desirable. It may be a practical route that people move. They may well also have to give up the desires to solve global problems in the way we currently envisage it. But that's another story. But I would just come back then to the issue of where the real opportunities are, because I think that's of interest to people. The opportunities are really right across the energy board. We're looking at a complete revamping in all scenarios. Hard rock, it takes longer, but in all scenarios, these new technologies are reshaping the opportunities we have. There will be stranded assets, as we identified 3 years ago. Coal is a starting point, and challenges for other hydrocarbon producers. But the opportunities lie, and we'll hear much more of this, I'm sure, in a few moments. The opportunities lie close to the customer. The restructuring in a world of much larger levels of electrification in modern jazz and unfinished symphony, 28 to 31% of total final consumption is electricity. And that's a big shift. Mm-hmm. It opens up a lot of opportunities in the context of digitalization, restructuring locally. I think the mobility revolution I briefly touched on, but it will include also hydrogen as we move forward. We're looking even at the potential under unfinished symphony. It seems small, but it's a really big start. 2% of total final consumption being hydrogen, and hydrogen moving either in form of hydrogen carriers or hydrogen itself. So this is really an exciting thing to keep in mind. I would say this is the age of disruption. So everything I've said requires you to think hard about other possibilities. And it's the age of disruptions that we need the tools and methodologies to address them adequately. And that, I believe, is what this work does and other work that's being initiated.
Thank you. Muqsit, let's build on, Jed started to hint at some of the implications for the energy system around these three scenarios. Modern jazz, very digitally, hyper, ratcheting up, very fast-paced world. Unfinished symphony with its emphasis on the role of policy coordination and how that enables technology, new technologies to take off. And hard rock as this world of tensions that don't get resolved so much at the global level. What are some of the key energy implications or the way we should think about these as energy?
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Angela, and thanks to the World Energy Council for including us as a partner in this seminal effort. It's been a pleasure working with yourself and the team. Let me sort of break the implications in terms of what they are and how to respond. But let me take us back to 3 years back in 2016 when we started the scenarios with the World Energy Council. And there were a number of interesting foresights and insights that Jed alluded to. But the one that really struck a chord, at least in the industry parlance, was around the peak demand for oil. And so as I think about and narrate the implications, I'm going to use that recipe, the recipe, that ain't broke. I don't like to fix it. So, I'll talk about 5 peaks and, what I call one non-peak, right? And picking up on what you said, Jed, across the 3 scenarios, right? So the first one is around peak energy intensity, or or energy per capita GDP. And so we see that peaking in the next few years, and that has interesting implications. In a world where we have 2 billion people that are underserved, another 2 billion that would be added to the population, it sort of is good news that the amount of per unit energy that would be required would be lower. So the second one, I would say, is the concept of peak value. And that's something that's hit the industry over this past decade, but more so in the last few months, we have seen signs of it. There was a reference to the coal industry, and I think it's becoming increasingly apt. The coal industry saw an 80 to 90% erosion of value over the last few years, and there really is a threat which is similar, and it's existential. The third, I would say, is around the notion of what I would call peak world. And it's not meant to be frivolous in any way, because these are, as I said, existential and significant. In none of our scenarios do we actually see us meeting the Paris 2 degrees Celsius goals. And that means that the world in its optimal form that we have may cease to sort of exist in this form. And that is something that's jarring. So think of this as peak world in some ways. There's a notion of peak trust, which is sort of the fourth point I would make. With the increased awareness and activism, both on the consumer side that Leo and Jed talked about, and on the investor side, what we are seeing is a greater level of the awareness and activism translating into themes like climate change, sustainability, operational integrity being high on the radar of almost everyone out there. And that actually poses a risk to the industry's license to operate and invest. And then the last peak is the peak globalization, which again was alluded to. Multilateralism making way for unilateralism and polarization. And I think it's an important facet. It's one that we explore to some extent in the Unfinished Symphony. I mean, coordinated policy action is a must. And to see that unraveling going on is certainly a reason to be concerned. The non-peak is around technology and innovation, right? The pace of change has never been faster, but it may actually never be slower either. And I think that could be our savior for the energy system and the energy industry. So those are the whats. If I may, in a couple of minutes, Angela, then say, what are the hows? How do you respond to each of those 5 things? I would say the first thing, and this comes up often in dialogues across the industry, is the notion of energy transition. Everyone talks about it. In some ways, it's seen as a bit of a threat. It isn't. We encourage industry leaders to think of this as a growth opportunity, as a means to get the social license to operate. There are opportunities that are emerging in everything from sustainable materials to the gas value chain to the power sector. And despite the flattening or plateauing of the energy intensity, the absolute growth in this offers opportunity for the industry. The second, I would say, is embrace consumer centricity, which is something that's been talked about. And let's put it in context, right? Despite this, the fact that the peak value, as I said, is rearing its ugly head, the fact of the matter is, energy is directly linked to prosperity. And we believe that there is about $80 to $100 trillion that needs to be invested in the energy system in the next 20 years. Capital expenditure, operating expenditure. And that's not going to get invested if investors don't get the return on their capital. And that inevitably is going to happen, that you will find means for companies to shift from extracting resources to actually fulfilling the needs of a consumer and a customer. And the means by which you do that, as Leo also alluded to, is going to change. It would be different business models, it's going to be policy changes, and it's going to be the application of technology closer to where the value pools are, which are going to be where the consumer sits. The third aspect that we consider as an important implication for the industry is the breadth of strategic choices is going to increase. And it, again, offers an opportunity to kind of blunt the impact of the notion of peak value. Another implication that's very important, and we talk about in the context of digitalization of the industry, and there's been a lot of talk around it over the last 2 years, but often in the context of transforming the industry for efficiency and cost gains. And we have found collectively through our work that could be $1 trillion impact. But the real value of digitalization is going to come from some of these trends kind of converging, where you actually use digital to manage your customer interfaces, where you actually use digital for managing emissions and hence influencing the climate agenda. And that impact is a multi-trillion-dollar impact. Then comes the aspect of designing for disruption, to the point that innovation and disruption, as usual, has become the modus operandi of the industry. And we think the industry today still thinks very much in terms of linear changes, single technology, single policy. But when you combine technology, policy, societal factors, business models into what we call constellations, and we'll touch on that a bit later, you get multiplicative effect and a network effect. And the industry has to think about what that really means. And I think that has some significant implications on all of the different transitions, whether it's a mobility transition or it's a power transition that we talk about. Then there is the notion, the sixth one, which is infrastructure and ecosystems really sit at the heart of these changes. In all of the scenarios that we look at, whether you're thinking about the transition to EVs and alternate fuels, infrastructure is actually becoming an important driver of the depth, the breadth, the direction of the change. Same goes for infrastructure in other sectors, solar and wind. And also, the fact that you have to leverage an ecosystem of partners, the best ones across the globe, becomes important. And that actually, I believe, also serves as an antidote to globalization. Last but not least is climate change. And we really need to raise our bar on climate change. As I said, none of the scenarios that we have done achieve that 2 degrees Celsius goal. And what you have to do is not just think that a little more would be sufficient. You actually have to get to the theoretical maximum over the next 20 years of all of the range of changes and innovations that we talk about, whether they are alternate fuels, whether it's electrification, it's carbon pricing, recycling, sustainable materials. All of that has to be firing on all cylinders over the next 20 years. So those are the different facets the industry has to kind of think about.
Thank you. Wow, we've gone through 3 scenarios, 3 different views of the future: modern jazz, unfinished symphony, and hard rock. We've touched on 5 peaks and 1 non-peak, and we've talked about 7 hows. And Leo, a mindset of disruption. What's a mindset of disruption?
Yeah, I think the key task of management is to simplify the world so in a way that your organization can handle it. So if I may just say one thing on what we have heard from Jed and Muqsit, I think this is a beautiful word for utility. It's just all coming our way. You know, like I'm an electric utility provider. I'm sitting on the infrastructure, and whatever innovation comes in, it's somehow going to be connected to the infrastructure we have. EVs, storage, decentralized generation, demand-side management, you name it, it's within the grid. So this is our bet. So with a peak value on the generation side, so maybe we should split. So we split the company and said we're going to go for infrastructure. Also, in such a world, can you be on top of all of these developments at the same time? You cannot, not even within partners. So you have to actually make your bets. So we made our bet. Our bet is infrastructure. We even get out of renewables as a price. To really focus on infrastructure, we are selling our renewables to finance that bet, if you want so. So for us, we have taken all of what we have just heard, and then we have said, no matter what the future is going to be, because we're going to be wrong about with our prediction, this is the bet we made. We go for infrastructure because that is where the innovation is going to take place. Now, I think what we now have to figure out is what are innovative disruptions which can change the game completely again. And so this is what we are really now struggling with because of the non-linear function. It's like we understand what a smart meter might do in a house. Mm-hmm. We understand ceteris paribus what a battery might do in a house, what an EV might do. We do not understand how that changes system dynamics when it all comes together at the same time at scale, and I think that's important, at scale. And whether then we can see a completely different world. And I think this is the next challenge for us, to figure out where are those constellations, what do we need to look for to really understand this is the opportunity which we need to size, because we can't size all opportunities, which is the one we really need to get right. Or at least, what is the sign we need to see earlier than others so that we move faster than others to size the opportunity once it arises. And I think actually, if I may, something which might not be popular with you, companies don't fail because they get the scenarios wrong or right. It's like we always get the future wrong. Yeah, I think companies fail if they're not fast enough to react to what they observe, or if they don't understand what they should observe in the first place.
Absolutely. Jed, you talked about the scenarios as these views that help people see different signals that are coming. Muqsit, you touched upon the fact that we live in this world around these combinations of things. And Leo, you've touched upon the fact that the challenge now is around this disruptive innovation play, which is the things that are coming together and that scales. Jed?
Well, really, 2 things. I think, first of all, we have a tendency to focus on potential technological innovations. I think it's probably fair to say we've done less than we would like, but more than many others, to consider as well social developments. Recognizing when technology and social developments come together, they tend to raise issues, new issues of policy, so what sort of policy developments will be. So I think acting in that sort of environment, you need to be really clued into your local context. The scenarios tend to leave the impression of big stories globally, but the more we look at things, it's going to be fundamentally locality restructuring. Localities may be quite large, they may be the size of a small country, but nevertheless, so it makes it quite a challenge for the World Energy Council to do things. I think, secondly, on the scenarios, I'm of the view that these are 3 different mindsets that coexist within this community. And I think without knowing which will be the dominant one going forward, and if you believe, for example, it's all about technological innovation, it's a modern jazz world, and unfinished symphony transpires, and you haven't even thought about it, I think you've missed a trick here. The challenge is to be able to survive and thrive as a business, as an enterprise. And therefore, it's advisable, because there are others in this community who think there are other futures they're working for, that you at least ask the question, if they happen, what should I be doing differently?
Yeah, so it's not that we get this scenario wrong, Leo. It's that we drink the Kool-Aid and think that the future that we want is the only one that could come about. There is, of course, a huge challenge for organizations in using global energy scenarios. There's many different sets of global energy scenarios. We did our own comparative study to lay out what the different assumptions were as we informed this work to work out what to focus on. And what we found out was clearly innovation is a very challenging thing to think about in the macro disruptive framework of a set of scenarios. To help us use these scenarios, we've invested in what we call the Designing for Disruption application tool. Who would like to lead off on how you can become a designer of disruption? Using these scenarios, Muqsit.
And before I go there, just we talked about scenarios being right or wrong, projections. I tell my clients, maybe perhaps a bit crudely, that an accurate forecast is an oxymoron, which we more aptly in our report say, futures cannot be predicted, or a future cannot be predicted, but futures can be invented. And I think that's an important tagline. The other aspect to think about is, as we talk about designing for disruption, is our industry, the energy industry, we have found through our work, is one of the most susceptible to disruption. And it's going through this phase of what we describe as compressive disruption, which is small changes that drive significant impact, to big bang disruption, which are these game-changing shifts. And so as we think about designing for disruption, one of the things to think about, or use as a starting point, is that we are in a state and situation where disruption as usual should be the mindset. So then what does designing for disruption really entail? We think there is sort of the four pillars of technology, policy, societal change, and business models, each with their own volatility and innovation and set of disruptions coming together that yields these non-linear changes, right? I think a good way to illustrate that maybe as a starting point is to think about personal mobility. We have a beautiful Tesla behind us. I know in talking to my kids that while the EV part of it is interesting, it's the interface, it's the technology inside the car, the fact that it's autonomous. Or could be autonomous is interesting. But if you think about the personal mobility transition and the Uberization of some of it, it isn't just that it was a ride-sharing platform. Let's take each of the four pillars, right? Let's think about technology. It really was the combination of cellular technology, which call it 3G, 4G, eventually will be 5G. It was GPS technology. It was the cloud. And in the future, more electrification and more autonomous vehicles adding to the technology pillar. Then you think in terms of the policy aspects, the ability to access the roads in urban centers as the regulators would see fit compared to the taxi industry, and opening that space up was fundamental to actually allowing the ride-sharing industry to flourish. So was the ability to qualify drivers, private car owners that could actually serve on the roads for the safety of the consumer. So policy changes. Then you think about societal changes. You're going from a mindset of ownership to a shared economy. People are valuing their leisure time and experiences over goods. And then you think about business models. There's a big shift going on towards offering things as a service. There's a shift towards capital light models. There's a shift towards more flexible workforce. And those are important considerations. Capital light model allows you to have a low cost mobility option, which makes the likes of Uber and the rest useful. So it was the combination of those things that yielded kind of this big impact. But even within that, as we in the industry think about, so what does that really mean? And that's where the constellations of disruption, as we call it, come into play, what we say is, if you look at that scenario, you have a case where you would say there is gains in terms of fuel efficiency, there's gains in terms of the utilization of the automobiles. But on the flip side, the ease of being able to move from one place to another at a lower cost means that there might be a rebound impact in terms of the miles driven and hence the consumption. So it's not a linear thing that you actually go one way or the other. And just to wrap it up, so what we designing for disruption in that sense, we say it's a constellation of disruption, which really is a collection of disruptions which at their intersection yield game-changing shifts in the way the industry works. And there are 4 steps that we talk about. One is go back to the mindset of disruption as usual. Second is keep yourself on top of future and evolving changes in technology, policy, societal changes, operating model. Step 3 is ensure that you're linked to an extended business ecosystem because no one entity can actually keep a handle on all of that. And 4th is to be creatively thinking about what these constellations are and actually what your response options would be, because there won't be a singular response to any of those.
Thank you. Leo, you wanted to come in on this.
Yeah, I just wanted to emphasize how much I think you get to the right point. As utility executives in the past, we tended to think about energy supply as a system task. So we provide a system, and then we optimize the systems as good engineers do. Society actually was just the recipient of the system. We did not understand that the system needs to reflect not only what we believe to be technically and from an innovation standpoint to be the best system, but also it needs to reflect desires of society. And I'll give you one example coming from Germany. German society did not want nuclear. Now, we thought as engineers, actually nuclear is a good supplement for a system. And there are many in the room who would actually agree, yes, it's a good idea. But the fact is, you cannot build a system, like just based on technological views and economic considerations and then do a business model if you do not understand what is the local context in which I'm moving, what is the society thinking. And if the society is too adamant against something, you can't just keep the business model alive as it is. And I know what I'm talking because I'm the largest nuclear operator in Germany. Yeah? We can't even decommission the station, not allow, so we could never build a new station. We can't even operate the stations properly. In the context in which we are, we can do that until 2022, but then it's over. So I think the constellation of disruption, it's not only about innovation, it's not only about the regulation and the policy, which is somehow reflecting innovation, it's also about what is society really keen to achieve. And we have neglected that as an industry far too often and far too much, which is also part of why we then eventually came to the conclusion we need to radically change the way we operate as E.ON in Germany.
In all our scenarios, Jed, we have this, as we said at the start, this shift towards a consumer-centric system. How do we avoid thinking that modern jazz is the only scenario with innovation in it?
Well, it isn't. I think, for me, we're talking about how we respond. I think number one is to have an active and attentive set of colleagues who are really bringing back to you their findings. These are devices to help us to think more clearly about what might be the types of turning points, and there are various forms of modern jazz. Nobody knows exactly when a technology will be fully mature, but we know something about the direction. We can identify signals. And this is, I think, a world where we're talking of everybody in an organization having a view that matters. And particularly when we get to customer-centric issues, everybody has a view on this, and correctly so. I think if you want an attentive, alert, opportunity-developing organization, you need to have some tools to help you. Not to tell you the answer, but to set your mind in a way that you can, out in the world, understand better than others the real signals that are emerging and that allow the Leos of this world to make these radical decisions. I mean, with confidence, because there's evidence, there's analysis, There's a collective sense of owning really big decisions to take an enterprise in a completely new direction. And that is very different from everything we've learned, I think, as energy, oil, gas, electricity executives.
I'm going to open up to some questions. So if people could prepare, if there's some point of clarification, a question around the 3 scenarios, the 5 peaks, the 7 implications, the disruptive innovation mindset. There's a rich banquet here. But Jed, most of the time when we take the World Energy Council scenarios out somewhere, I get asked a question. The first question I usually get asked is, which one's going to come true? Which one should we be planning for? Which one do you like best? Is that the right way to think about these?
Well, when you do work like this and you're in a congress like this, you can view these as rather sort of standalone artifacts and have a bit of fun with them. I think it's not bad since I believe that these are 3 mindsets which exist in different ways within this community, in the broader community. I think you can play around with them. You can ask an audience which is the dominant, what's their view, which they prefer. You can answer all sorts of questions. I think importantly, at the root of this is if in an organization there are very distinctly different sets of mindsets, you need to bring them together and, in all honesty, review them and be tough on people. Where's the evidence? You hold this view. Why do you hold this view? Which is beyond evidence. It may be emotional. It may be intuitive.
Let's give it a go. Right.
Okay, off you go.
Under people's seats, there's an orange card. If you can find your orange card, you've listened to a video that has 3 different scenarios in it: modern jazz, unfinished symphony, and hard rock. You get 1 card only. If you think modern jazz is the scenario that is going to dominate, raise your card now. Or your hand if you haven't got a card. Raise your card. Okay, so look around the room. These are the modern jazzers. Thank you. If you think unfinished symphony is the future that's going to dominate, raise your card now. Ooh, we have fewer. Thank you. If you think hard rock is the future that's going to dominate, this is this fragmented world, raise your card now. Oh, we have a hard rock audience. Thank you very much.
Should we play some music?
We could play some music later. So that is a remarkable shift from 3 years ago.
Yeah.
This reinforces what we said, that the world has pivoted much more towards signals around hard rock. Are there some questions from anyone in the audience? Anybody who'd like to ask a question? William, please.
A few weeks ago, I was challenged by somebody when I explained or tried to explain the 3 scenarios. And then the person basically is a researcher working on particular types of technology and said, well, this may be a possible, or 3 possible futures, but we actually consider this more as a fashion, as a fad, what is going on. It's a real transitional type of thing. People will get tired of all these things, talking about disruptions, talking about these things. We're moving more and more. Not everybody has rooftops to put PV on their roof. Some people live more vertically than in single houses. We see more and more utility scale PV than offshore wind. The big units might come back, and indeed, and transportation might become electric and all these things, but people will just get tired of it. And it was so easy in the past to put the thing in the plug, and they probably will come back. So maybe if we go 2 or 3 generations further, maybe the big units, the big generation units, just stable and base load and these things will come back. It's just a fad. What is your reaction? So the idea basically is to some extent that maybe the symphony thing is not even extreme enough. Maybe it's so.
Thank you. So that's
exactly the other way around.
The question is all this disruption and this decentralization and the shift away from centralized convenience a fad?
Well, you know, everything can be viewed as a fad. I think in reality, we're looking at a new, not potentially, we can see emerging a new set of technologies. There is, in my view, a fundamental uncertainty about the rates of diffusion. And people have really find it difficult, I find it difficult, to understand rates of diffusion. There's something quite exceptional about what we're asking ourselves to do at the moment. When you look historically back to the 18th century and the great energy transitions that have occurred, they were emergent transitions. They emerged out of a suite of technology developments, increasing prosperity, new desires, to have some very basics around water, sanitation, and so on. And they've been extraordinary in their. This is not an emergent energy transition. We have set ourselves a set of objectives out there to move at a pace which is at least twice the rate of prior energy transitions. I don't believe that what's happening is a fad. I think it's true that we can get overly involved in technology innovation and forget the others. And I think, as our colleagues have said, that's being addressed.
Leo?
Yeah, I also believe there is a misunderstanding. Renewables and decentral and central, there's always this debate. I think it's just a misunderstanding. An offshore wind farm is by all means, from a grid standpoint, a central station. It's sitting at the end of a line. It's actually 25 square miles, but it's one central station. The same if I build a decentral generation, onshore generation in eastern Germany, and the load center is in southern Germany, I need to build a line between eastern Germany and southern Germany, and by all means, from a technical standpoint, all this decentral, onshore is, from a grid standpoint, a central generation unit at the end of a line. So actually, I don't want to think in terms of central and decentral. The question I have is, are we going to go to a more renewable world? No question, yes. Are we moving to a world where we will have coexistence of technologies? And the answer is yes. One of the findings of the World Energy is also there is no silver bullet technology. So if somebody says it will be all decentral and small, say you didn't get it. So it's going to be a coexistence of all technologies at the same time, and I would actually suggest not to think in terms of categories like central and decentral. It's not going to be helpful.
Okay, let me ask some more questions. Who's got another question? We've got one over here. It's Jules. Hi, Jules.
Hi, Angela. Jules Quaterner of Rocky Mountain Institute. I wonder whether we have missed one critical uncertainty. You've laid out that none of the scenarios hit the 2-degree marker. But last year, the IPCC pointed out that, in fact, 2 degrees is no longer good enough, that the world has to aim for a 1.5-degree world in order to avoid the most damaging catastrophes of climate change. What would the world look like if we had a critical uncertainty suddenly hit us on climate change? When this recent storm would not have churned for 3 days over the Bahamas, but over Miami, and Miami would have been wiped out, and a new Democratic administration in the United States would implement a dramatically different energy policy. Is it conceivable that a massive disruption related to climate change shifts government's policy dramatically into the direction of one or another scenario?
Thank you. So here's Mother Nature as a disruptor. Have we done enough? Do the scenarios of course don't take us to a normative outcome of a future that we would like and prefer to see. But they are designed, Jed, as these frames for thinking about the different signals. Have we thought long and hard enough about Mother Nature as a disruptor in putting these scenarios together?
Well, you never think long and hard enough about anything. But to pick up John's point, the 1.5 degrees centigrade, very real, at least in terms of some of the current discussions amongst our climate change practitioners. I think that's taking out, you can correct me, Jean, it's taking out around maybe 600 gigatons of CO2 as a carbon budget. It would mean we'd have to really turn the system around. noticeably, much more radically than we do, when I say turn the system around, have peak CO2 and move down very quickly. You've got to do that within matters of years rather than, say, within a decade. We're not even well set up for a decade. What we've included, if you go into the report, we've taken from the IPCC the sort of challenges on the environmental side, and they are many and diverse and quite shocking. What does it take, and I think we've struggled with this, what does it take for collective action of the type you imply? Is it the sort of disaster you were talking about? I think one of the things that's missing in all of this discussion is laying out much more clearly the fundamental costs of climate change. They're around what adaptation will cost you, in the increased deaths that will occur, the breakdown of ecosystems. We have all of that as bits and pieces and laid out in part of the reports, but it doesn't in a concise way reach the public. And activist groups, some of them are getting extremely angry because of this. So there are social developments underway that potentially could address this, but we need to get our sums, because a lot of action requires a clarity around the costs and benefits of action. And as you were pointing out, there are potential outcomes which will shift minds.
More questions, please. I'm just making sure I'm not missing anybody. Can I take two at once? Alessandro, and then we'll take this gentleman here, please.
Good morning, everyone.
Good
I'm
morning.
Sandro Clerici from Italy. Just every one of us would like to have a stable transition and effective. But clearly, the transition has moved a lot of interest and is becoming a large business involving a long chain of interest. Mm-hmm. The problem is, if we accelerate too much without evaluating the costs and without defining who is going to pay, we can have bubbles and create terrible reactions from those who are going to pay the costs. I would like to have some impact, because we always understand of investment and so on, but
okay.
no one is mentioning how much it costs and who is going to pay.
If I can take this question as well, please.
Yes, good morning. And actually, I'm following on very nicely from that question. Peter Godfrey of the Energy Institute. Muqsit talked a lot about value, and we also talked about pro-consumerism and, you know, the consumer taking over. I'd like to also raise the question of cost, but in terms of price. Is it not the case that today we're living in a world where energy is priced within a model that was created 110 years ago? And actually what we need to do is to create a fundamentally different pricing structure on which to base the value of the future. So to me, my question around scenarios is how we realign price with value. My view today, and the theory would be, that the two are increasingly becoming out of alignment with each other.
Thank you.
Maybe
Muqsit.
I'll start off and maybe bringing the two questions together. I think I made a reference earlier to the fact that as we think about this energy transition and look ahead to the next 20 years, the amount of investment that would need to go into the system is in the order of magnitude of $80 to $100 trillion. That's what is needed for mankind to prosper and to have the same standard of living as what we have enjoyed, and maybe even greater over time. And it's also very clear, if you look at the capital markets, that there is an increased emphasis on return on capital employed, in addition to an increased emphasis on doing the right thing from a sustainability standpoint. And the two are actually now coming together in a very harmonized fashion, where I think the ability for some short-term bubbles to form is perhaps always there. But from a medium to long-term standpoint, there's enough vigilance around the system to force a much more, not linear, but a much more smooth transition towards the future. It's going to be one where multiple stakeholders, from the investors to the policymakers to the to the technology developers, will be paying a lot of attention to, right? And that I guess feeds into your question as well, which is we've talked about the shift from commodity-centric to consumer-centric. The pricing regime of the past was very much a cost-plus. You have a cost of extracting a resource. You put a certain rent on it, whether it's oil and gas or even utilities. The regulated utility sector is actually an example of that. But with a consumer-centric world, it's going to be based on the inherent value that an individual user of an energy molecule or electron actually derives from it. And that actually would lead to a more efficient market or an efficient clearing mechanism, which I think would adjust some of these misalignments that we see across different geographies and different energy markets. So I think that is going to be a first step towards a reform that's certainly needed. Now, what we have to keep in mind is some of the what we have seen in Europe in terms of the pushback from the consumer on the street. It's actually also a reflection of that, right? For them to not see the incremental value and still be asked to pay for it is not going to be justified. So by focusing on the right set of growth opportunities, right set of investments, making the consumer of the future realize what is incremental that they are getting, then perhaps the willingness to pay more would increase as well, or pay the right price would be achieved as well.
Muqsit, I would like to add one point. I agree with everything you said, but on the other side, there's also the fact whether we have been efficient in doing that. So yes, we might need to adjust the pricing, but if we have the trilemma still there, right? So if we go for equity and sustainability, we also need to go for economics, so to say. Yes? And we have seen regions where we focus too much on one of the goals only, and we neglected the other, and that's going to create a backlash. We have, however, seen over the last years that from a trilemma perspective, most countries are moving the right direction to look at all targets at the same time. So whilst I would completely agree with everything you said, I would just add, it is important that while we do what you just described, we also keep in mind that we need to achieve more than one goal within our industry. Otherwise, we'll always get a backlash.
Very well put.
Thank you. Before I take any more questions, I'd like to invite David Kim, who's the chair of the World Energy Council and the chair and co-founder of Daesung Energy, to offer his reflections on the work of the scenario work of the World Energy Council.
Good morning. We have just embarked on a journey across a vast ocean, uncharted ocean called the Grand Energy Transition, with 3 ships named decarbonization, decentralization, and digitalization. Given the enormity of scale and speed and scope of challenges, no one knows for certain what awaits us and how, when, or whether we reach our final destination of a sustainable energy future. Once we have unexpected heroes like James Watt and Nikola Tesla for the first and second industrial revolution. Perhaps we now need a second Columbus to lead our voyage. However, we need, most of all, a reliable compass to check where we are headed. That's precisely why we need realistic alternative scenarios at the moment. Just as Columbus reached the New World in lieu of the professed plan to find a route to India, we might achieve a sustainable prosperity for all as well on our journey toward a new haven of sustainable energy future. I commend NG and Jed and for this wonderful and their excellent team for this wonderful output. And WEG will always be proud of you and your work. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful metaphor to use to remind ourselves that we're courageous. You are the Columbus of E.ON, setting sail into a new energy future, mapping out your course, but actually these scenarios are like the weather systems or the context that you might encounter on the journey. They're not designed to be the end point, Jules. They're designed to be the context that we use to make our navigation. We left on the point of price and value, and I would just like to find Tom Kober, who is we have our modeling partner. Our scenarios contain not just narratives, they also contain systems map and illustrative quantification. And I would like to give Tom the chance to address the question of price and value. Tom, how do you model for price and value?
Thank you very much, Angela, and thank you for this question. And actually, to quantify these scenarios, we employ a global energy systems model, which entails all the interdependencies of the energy system on regional level and over the whole chain, from resource extraction until final energy consumption. And actually, what we see is that in the next decades, 50% of the investments are needed in the Asian market. So the Asian market is a particular a market where you have to invest in future because there we have the highest growth. And what we also see is that you have to price the services. So it's not just about the unit of energy, but it's also about the energy security. It's about providing mobility. So it's a service of mobility. So it's a service of energy end users. And all this has to be has taken into consideration when we looked at these three futures. And it's extremely important that we also, if you want to achieve certain goals, so provide secure energy, that we also provide stable investment conditions. So here also policy making is in charge to provide a stable energy policy framework, which then enables the investments which are needed in future.
Thank you. Thank you, Tom. Gentlemen, we're approaching the end of our session, and we've covered a lot of ground. The future's a big place, if you haven't noticed. It's sort of infinite. We've had a go at structuring it into 3 different possible future contexts that are useful mindsets for thinking about how new signals have changed and what they mean, for anticipating where disruption might come from. And we've also tried to work out how to become designers for disruption using these scenarios and also the new concept of constellations of disruption. That's a lot for everybody to take in. So what would be your advice? What's the question, the reflection, the key point? My piece will be, please read, have access to these 2 different documents, the scenarios, become a designer of disruption. That's my takeaway. Jed, what's your key takeaway for this audience?
Well, I think you should want in your organization people who are perceptive about the signals that matter. And this is one of the sets of inputs that can help you think more clearly about what you should be looking at. There is no certain future out there. You just want to make sure that you are protected from the worst and you can enable the best. And these have a role. I mean, in some organizations, they are only a starting point. In some organizations, they could be clearly discussed. In others, less useful. Think locality, think local, but be aware of how the global shapes your future, the future you can create.
Thank you. Muqsit.
I'll probably echo what Jed said, but I would say, in whatever role or capacity you serve in the industry, think about how you are going to push yourself in your organization to design for what could be instead of just thinking about improving what is. I think that is going to be one of the most important shifts you can actually push forward in whatever role capacity you serve in.
Thank you. Leo.
I would give it a little different twist. Yes, we need to do all of that, but I think what we need is we need to instill in our teams some optimism. The optimism that we can cope with these daunting challenges of innovation and technology changes, system changes, some optimism, Jules, that we can somehow go beyond what we see today and maybe achieve more than what we see currently. I think if we can't instill this optimism in our companies and our societies, then it's going to be tough, because then, you know, all these difficulties will just drag us down. So my takeaway would be just be optimistic. There is a future, you know, with the right mindset. There's so much we can do which we wouldn't have believed possible a year ago. So go for it.
Please, I'd like to invite the audience to thank Jed, Muqsit, Leo. Thank you very much for helping introduce and position the World Energy Council scenarios.